we'd be living in a dog-eat-dog society, a sort of Thatcherite, Reaganite, carried to an extreme. We would be indulging in rape and pillage and sort of things that Vikings were historically reputed to do, or Genghis Khan. And we've got beyond that. In one respect, we haven't got beyond it, because one of the things that was built into our gene, into our brains by genetic selection, was a tendency for brains to set up goals and purposes which originally would have had the purpose or goal of propagating genes. So originally we were equipped in our brains with the tendency to set up purposes like find food, find a cave to live in, find a water hole, take care to avoid being eaten by a lion, all aimed towards the ultimate goal of reproduction. But because we were given in our brains the software to set up goals and sub-goals and sub-sub-goals, we can use that software, that goal-seeking software, to set up other goals that actually have nothing to do with reproduction. We can set up a goal to write a book and satisfy the publishers. We can set up a goal to win a football game. We can set up a goal to, well, all the different things that we do. We most of the time are setting up short-term goals that we want to achieve, little knowing that the goal-seeking software that we're using was originally put there by natural selection for the ultimate goal of reproducing, of having lots of children. But we've cut the ground from under the feet of that. We now set up these other goals, which our ancestors always did anyway, but in that case their sub-goals were directed towards the ultimate goal of reproduction. Nowadays they're set up, they're directed towards other goals, like, as I say, reading a book, or finishing, writing a book. The goal of reproduction in any case is well served by the more proximate goal of having sex, which we still do whether we want our selfish genes to go jump in the lake or not. And in our primitive ancestors it would have been enough to have a strong sex drive. That would have, children would tend to sort of follow automatically in a world without contraception. But nowadays, in a world with contraception, we can all enjoy ourselves and tell our genes to go and jump in the lake.
One of, and perhaps the most sort of innovative and also controversial aspect of your genetic thesis is the concept of the extended phenotype. And just reading from The Selfish Gene, the definition of the extended phenotype is an animal's behavior or their appearance, because it's not limited to how they behave, it's also how they look, their size, and so forth, tends to maximize the survival of the genes for that behavior or physical characteristic, whether or not those genes happen to be in the body of the particular organism performing it. Maybe a little complicated.
Yes, okay. When I said that the fate of the genes is bound up in the vehicle that they ride about in, that is true most of the time. But my second book, The Extended Phenotype, which was written mainly for a professional audience, generalizes the principle and points out that actually the phenotype, the phenotype is the external manifestation of genetic tendencies. And mostly phenotypes are parts of the body in which the genes ride. So the legs of a beaver, the tail of a beaver, the eyes of a beaver, the whiskers of a beaver, the fur of a beaver, these are all phenotypic manifestations of genes inside the beaver, genes riding around inside the vehicle that is the beaver, and their survival is served by the effects that they have on the hair, the tail, the legs, the eyes, the muzzle, etc. of the beaver. But of course, beavers also do other things, well-known things, like they build dams and lodges. And the dam of a beaver is, this was really my contribution, the dam of a beaver is part of its phenotype. Because in exactly the same way as genes survive because of their effects on the body of the vehicle in which they ride, in special cases like beaver dams, genes survive by virtue of their effects on the dam, which is not part of the beaver's body, and is not something that they ride inside, but nevertheless is phenotypic effect in the same way as the tail of the beaver or the whiskers of the beaver is phenotypic effect. So any animal artifact, a bird's nest, a spider's web, a beaver dam, a termite mound, these all can be regarded as extended phenotypes. So that was the first step in the argument of the extended phenotype. And then I generalized it to say, well, in the same way as the beaver dam or the caddis house, you know, caddis larvae are, caddis flies are fairly nondescript sort of brown insects that fly about, but their larvae build for themselves little houses out of stones or out of sticks or out of little tiny snail shells, and they cement them together and they make a beautiful little house in which the larva lives. So it's like a snail shell, but it's built by the behavioral efforts of the larva. It's a most remarkable process to watch, the building of a caddis larva house. Now, the house in which the caddis lives is an extended phenotype. Now compare that to a snail. A snail has a shell which is secreted by the body of the snail and is part of the normal phenotype of the snail. Now consider a parasite, a fluke, say, living inside the snail. And the fluke gains protection from the snail shell, just as the snail gains protection from the snail shell, and just as the caddis larva gains protection from the stone house. But the fluke, at least in some cases, has an influence on the snail shell. Snails that have a fluke inside them, at least in one case that I studied, snails that have a fluke inside them have thicker shells than snails without a fluke. It looks as though the fluke is, this kind of worm, it looks as though the fluke is improving the snail shell for its own good. Why would it do that? Why if the snail shell could be improved, why doesn't the snail do it anyway? See what I'm building toward, that the snail shell, or the extra thickening of the snail shell, is part of the extended phenotype of genes in the fluke. Natural selection comes along and favors genes in the fluke that have phenotypic influence on the snail shell. Why doesn't the snail do it anyway? Because there's a compromise between the needs of survival and reproduction. A snail that had a shell that was too thick would be less likely to reproduce because it puts too much work, too much energy into thickening its shell and doesn't have enough left over for reproduction. So the optimum shell thickness for the fluke, for the parasite inside the snail, is thicker than for the snail itself, which is why I'm saying that the thicker shell is an extended phenotype of the fluke. Generalizing that again, any time that a parasite has an effect on its host, which many of them do, sometimes quite remarkable effects, we can call that an extended phenotype. There's another kind of worm called a brain worm, which infects ants. And an infected ant, it has its behavior changed. The brain worm actually burrows into the brain of the ant and makes a lesion in the brain of the ant, just like a physiologist might make a lesion in the brain of the ant, and causes the ant to, instead of going down into the ground in the heat of the day, the ant goes up stems, grass stems, to the top where it shouldn't be in the middle of the day. and there it becomes vulnerable to be eaten by a sheep, which is exactly what the brainworm wants, because the brainworm's next host after the ant is a sheep. There are lots and lots of examples of parasites manipulating their hosts for their own advantage, and I want to regard every one of those changes in the host behavior as an extended phenotype. Finally, a parasite doesn't actually have to live inside its host. Cuckoos and cowbirds, which are sort of American equivalent of cuckoos, parasitize other birds by laying eggs in the other bird's nest, and then the cuckoo hatches out. And I talk about cuckoos, not cowbirds, European cuckoos. And all kinds of adaptations of the nestling cuckoo influence the host, cause the host bird to rear it, to feed it. You see grotesque pictures of gigantic baby cuckoos dwarfing their foster parent, and the foster parent is frantically working to stuff food into the gaping maw of the cuckoo. The cuckoo somehow manages to exert an influence on the behavior of the host. That, again, is an extended phenotype, even though the cuckoo doesn't live inside its host. Then you can generalize that to any influence that animals have on each other. The nightingale song, proverbially intoxicating. My heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though hemlock I had drunk. 1 minute passed, and Lethe-wards had sung. Keats was not a bird, he was a mammal. But the effect, the drugging effect, as though of hemlock I had drunk, the drugging effect on John Keats is, I'm conjecturing, the same as the male nightingale is having on the female nightingale. So the female nightingale is being drugged by the male nightingale song, manipulated. It's as though a brain physiologist had come along and injected a drug into the female. The male can't do that. He doesn't have a hypodermic, but he does have a voice, and the voice has been honed over generations to become an extremely powerful, intoxicating influence, so intoxicating that it even intoxicated John Keats, at whom it was not aimed, since he's not a female nightingale. Okay, that's enough on the extended phenotype. Sorry.
Now, as you know better than any of us, there have been a number of sort of questions and challenges and criticisms of the evolutionary biological thesis of the role of genetic mechanisms, including the extended phenotype. Just to sort of ask you to try and comment, refute a couple of the most obvious. One is altruism. How do you explain altruism? And you invoke or you describe your belief in the Hamilton rule. William Hamilton, a colleague of yours, a friend. I'll allow you to explain that to the audience. And then, does that apply to one of your Oxford mentors, Mike Cullen, who had such a significant influence in your career?
Yes, the book, The Selfish Gene, could just as well have been called The Altruistic Gene, because much of the book is actually about altruism. It's widely misunderstood as being a book about selfishness or even an advocacy of selfishness. It's thought to be that by people who've read the book by title only. Reading the title and omitting the rather large footnote, which is the book itself. A lot of it is about altruism, and it discusses two main ways in which altruistic organisms are favoured by selfish genes. Selfish genes, because they are the immortals, because they're the ones that go through the generations, they achieve this feat of going through the generations partly by programming their bodies, their vehicles, into being very good at surviving at the expense of others. That would be being selfish. Partly by programming them to reproduce, obviously, partly to the next generation, if you're a gene, if you don't cause your vehicle to reproduce. But also, there is another way to do it, with collateral kin. You can calculate, and it's been done several times, you can calculate the probability that a gene in you will be in any relative you like a nephew, a niece, a sister, a great-nephew, a grandchild. And the probability is a known function, it's easy to calculate. So if you imagine a gene 4 making an individual be altruistic towards, say, nieces, that gene has a 25% chance of ending up in the body of the niece helped. So therefore, if the cost to the altruist is not very great, and the benefit to the niece, to the beneficiary, is great, and in this case it's the 25%, it has to be 4 times as great, then that gene will survive. There will be a tendency for that gene to survive. Bill Hamilton, whom you've just mentioned, my colleague and friend, was the one who worked out this theory, worked it out very thoroughly in 1964. He himself was a great expert in social insects, and which of course are the supreme altruists who look after kin other than their own offspring. Most of the work in an ant colony or a termite colony or a beehive is done by workers who are sterile, who have no prospect of reproducing themselves, but instead put all their efforts into the reproduction of the queen or males and the rearing of young queens and young males who may be their younger siblings or their nephews and nieces. So the social insects are the sort of showcase of this theory of kin selection. And although they're the showcase, the theory applies to all animals, even if they don't actually show altruism towards collateral kin, towards nephews and nieces or brothers and sisters. The reason they don't show it is that the economics of the situation don't favour it. You'll only get an actual evolution of sibling altruism or niece altruism if the economic circumstances favour it, taking into account this probability factor of the probability of sharing a gene. It happens that the economic circumstances of ants, bees, wasps and termites are such as to favour extreme kin altruism, and there are quite a number of other animals which are a little bit less extreme. Quite a lot of birds like acorn woodpeckers in California, quite a lot of mammals, the most extreme being the naked mole rat of East Africa, which are kind of vertebrate equivalents of social insects. So it's a powerful theory and a correct one.
So, Elwood, here's where the schizophrenia comes in. So then, how do you understand conditions, diseases such as autism or schizophrenia, which the reproductive capacity of individuals is significantly impaired, but their population frequency remains stable or even increases if you believe the CDC figures of rates of autism in the United States? The question of why we have any genetic diseases at all, of course, is easily answered by mutations.